This meeting is being recorded.
Hi, everyone. I think we'll get started now. Looks like most people are here. Thank you for being here. Today, a majority of us are joining in from Shigagong, or Chicago. Let us always remember that we are on Indigenous land. The region we now refer to as Chicago, along with a larger region, has always been home to Indigenous peoples, including the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe, and the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia Nations, the Miamia, the Wea, the Ho-Chunk, the Menominee, the Thakiwaki, the Meskwaki, the Kigapoy, and the Mascouten, among many other Indigenous nations. Chicago is also home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States, and this land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples. The institutions we work in and for are settler colonial structures on land stolen through genocide against Indigenous communities. These structures have and continually exploit Black and Indigenous people, and we must be cognizant of that when we have conversations about racial justice. These conversations are intrinsically linked to conversations for Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, and conversations about transnational solidarity. It is our responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations on whose lands we are situated. With that being said, we are happy to welcome you into this space today. The session we have planned is called Perspectives on the Prison Industrial Complex and the Landscape of Carceral America. My name is Cami. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a Malay and white woman with brown hair and freckles and a black shirt on in my apartment in Chicago. I will be helping to facilitate this session along with Vikrant, whom I will invite to introduce himself now.
All right, thanks, Cami. Hi, everyone. My name is Vikrant. I am a brown-skinned South Asian person. I use he, him pronouns. Currently, I have black hair. I'm wearing glasses, and I'm wearing a blue shirt. And in the background, I have a bookshelf and my curtains. So we wanted to first talk about our access needs in this space. So, you know, in this kind of session, we want everyone to be able to be as present as they can be. And we understand that everyone has their own specific needs to address in this moment. And so please do what you need to in order to be present. So if, you know, for some people that's doodling off camera, for some people that's with their camera off, for some people that is making sure that they're taking notes. Whatever that looks like for you, please go ahead and do that. And also let us know if your access needs are not being met. If there's something that we can address in this moment, feel free to message any of the people that are listed on the slide. So that is myself, Cami, who was just talking, Peter Lorenz, Akila Ali, and Taylor So. They're all people that you can send a chat message to. So please do so if you have anything that you want us to address that we can in this moment.
So the Chicago Health Coalition for Black Lives is a non-hierarchical group of students and health professionals organizing for radical change in our health systems and Chicago. We believe in the abolition of all oppressive structures, and we believe in centering the lived experience of Black and Brown organizers on the ground. Our political education team is responsible for delivering teachings such as this one to create an open access virtual curriculum. Next slide. Okay, so the agenda, we are going to introduce our speakers for the session and do a little bit of grounding. Then we'll cover some of the objectives we have for today. We're going to define the prison industrial complex together because we understand that making meaning together is important when we're using this language. We're going to discuss our complicity and the violence of the prison industrial complex. Our speakers, Kay and Lam, are going to outline some of the means of resistance they've taken up. We'll have a Q&A portion followed by a reflective small group area of the Zoom, and then we'll bring everyone back to the main room and we'll close out. And that would be it.
Cool, thank you. So I'm going to introduce the speakers. So first up, we have Kay Agbabi. So Kay is a macro social worker and organizer based in New York. They earned their MSW from the University of Michigan School of Social Work. The majority of their work revolves around political education and organizing strategy in regards to prison abolition. Kay is an active member of Survived and Punished New York, a grassroots group working to free criminalized survivors of gender and sexual violence. They are also a member of several abolitionist collectives across New York City and a co-creator of 8toabolition.com. You can follow Kay on Twitter and Instagram at ShayButterFem. And next we have Lam. So Lam is the executive director of Beyond Legal Aid. Its model, community activism lawyering, shifts the power of the law into the hands of impacted communities by partnering with them to create community-located, community-operated, and community-directed activism law programs. Beyond's radical network of community programs unites lawyers and activists to bring free legal services to over 4,000 people annually, including undocumented immigrants, sex workers, day laborers, and activists, while impacting thousands more through its support of grassroots organizing, advocacy, and activism. Lam graduated from Harvard Law School and holds additional graduate degrees from Brown University and Oxford University. He was previously chairperson of the Illinois HIV/AIDS Response Review Panel and served on the boards of the Community Law Project and the Vietnamese Association of Illinois. And at this time, we'd really invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. Feel free to share whatever you're comfortable with. Suggestions are, names, pronouns, where you're coming from, why you're interested in this. So feel free to do so in the chat as we continue. So we wanted to talk a little bit about our working agreements going into this space. We have a larger list of community agreements as well that our facilitators can reference in the small groups, but we wanted to start off with just these quick 5. So again, going back to our access needs, we want you to be able to show up as you are. So we understand that everybody is going through something different, and we want you to be able to be as present as you can be. And so just show up as you need to in this space. We want you to take care of yourself. And the last 3 are what we consider to be very important as well. We want this space to be collaborative. So we want to learn together. And that means that we need to respect each other, we need to hear from each other, and we need to be willing to learn from each other. We want to be able to ask questions of ourselves. What we know from learning, the most important part of learning is self-reflection and self-study. So we want people to be able to do that. And lastly, in this discussion, and especially in the small groups, we want people to be aware of the space that they're taking up. So if you notice that you're talking a lot, maybe now is the time to step back. If you notice that you haven't really had a chance to talk, feel free to do so. Do whatever makes you feel comfortable, but make sure that you're creating a space that's inviting and welcoming for everyone. And here we have mine and Cammie's phone numbers. So the first one is mine and the second one is Cammie's. If you feel any of these agreements are being violated and you don't feel comfortable saying so publicly, just text us. We can do our best to handle it. And most importantly, this is a space for self and communal reflection. So show up in whatever way is best for you so that you can participate in this session. And lastly, we just wanted to talk about how the session should look. So this isn't meant to be a lecture. I know Cammie and I are doing a lot of talking, but that's more so just to ground people at the beginning. But it is going to be a facilitated conversation. And so we do encourage participation and questions. There's going to be a lot of collaborative exercises throughout the session. And also if you type any questions, we will be keeping track of them. We have folks keeping track of them. And so if they're not answered until the Q&A, we do at least have them compiled so they will be answered then. And lastly on there, as you can see, there will be room for Q&A at the end where folks can type or ask their questions over the microphone. All right, and with that, I will now hand it over to Lon and Kate.
Hi. Sorry my camera is off. I just moved and my Wi-Fi has been like malfunctioning all week. But yeah, this is pretty much the scope of the presentation. We'll be defining the prison industrial complex, providing critical perspectives on complicity, and then discussing how to leverage our positionality. I come from an organizing background, so a lot of my contribution to the presentation will be from that perspective.
And hi, everyone. So I come from a legal background. So it's probably going to be, my experience and my perspective is probably going to be a bit more rigid and less radical than Kay's. But I actually, prior to law school, I actually was a community organizer as well, working particularly in gay men's health. So it's been a while, but I definitely try to incorporate it into my work. One thing I really want to emphasize, which I think the facilitators have already mentioned, is, can I have experiences that we'd like to share with you? But I think we really want to engage with you in order to think through these issues. And it's not issues that we can give you answers for, or it's not something that we can tell you what to think. I think that what we're hoping for is that we can share with our experiences and hear from your experiences so that everyone can leave with their own sense of what the prison industrial complex is and how their relationship and their complicity can be addressed in thinking through these issues. So I guess I'll start then, Kay. So I think the first thing we want to talk about is really understanding the problem. So I think here we have, an image that shows just how extensive the incarceration problem is in the U.S. 2.3 million people confined, and keep in mind that this is allocated over many different forms of incarceration, whether they be state prisons or federal prisons or local institutions, but then there are also civil commitments. And then also an area that I have a lot of experience with is immigration detention. There are, for immigrants who are detained by the government, there are both immigration specific detention centers, and then also contracts that the government has with what are typically prisons, which then house immigrants who are detained and are waiting for either trials or for deportation. And one of the things that's really disturbing for those who work with immigrants is that a lot of the protections that are guaranteed under the Constitution for prisoners actually don't apply to immigrants. So they may be housed in the same prison centers, but they actually have fewer constitutional rights than the traditional concept of an inmate in a prison system. And one thing I do want to mention, and then I want to pass it over to Kay to see if any thought, and if she wants to add anything before we open up to you guys, is keep in mind that when we're talking about the problem, we're talking about 2.3 million people who are incarcerated, but that does not include all the people who are impacted by the incarceration of 2.3 million people. So we're talking about the families, that have to deal with the loss or the not having their parents or their children home with them. And then also you have people who are, for example, going through the judicial system and awaiting sentencing, or who then have to go through legal proceedings to avoid incarceration. So that number 2.3 million is really, really an underestimate of the problem and its impact in the country. At this point, I'll pass it on to Kay. I apologize, I think I referred to Kay as with the wrong pronoun. Kay's pronoun is they, them, so I'll pass it to them now.
Thank you. I was just gonna say that while these numbers are astonishing, I think it's twice as many people are also, they're incarcerated not in maybe like literal physical jails, but through things like e-carceration. So things like ankle monitoring or probation, or they're involved with alternatives to incarceration programs, which kind of hold the threat of incarceration over their head. And so it's really interesting because when we talk about the prison industrial complex, a lot of people are thinking about literal prisons, but many more people are touched by the prison industrial complex through e-carceration and things similar to that. I can start on this slide. So yeah, the prison industrial complex, the term or the idea, it came out of a group which is called Critical Resistance, which features members such as Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore. But it basically is the way to describe the overlap between like the public and private sector, and the way that people are profiting off of the incarceration of other people. And it's specifically called industrial complex, like prison industrial complex, because it's kind of like the term is meant to like mirror the idea of the military industrial complex and also draw the connections between the two, and make it clearer the ways that the prison industrial complex and the military work hand in hand to hold people against their will. And yeah, that's all I'll say for now, because I think we're going to go over a graphic which will have more information.
And I think this sort of working on the definition is something that we really want to be a collaborative process and really get everyone, give everyone an opportunity to contribute to a shared understanding of the prison industrial complex. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, facilitators, but I think we really want to hear from the people on this presentation, on this webinar, to contribute to what they understand the purpose, speak to some of the actors and structures that they see involved in the complex, who is directly impacted. And then Kay's already gone into some of this regarding the why it's called an industrial complex. But I think there are a lot of other salient points that I'm sure people have around this idea of it being an industrial complex.
You're totally right, Lon. So I am going to put up this and share my screen as I am. I'm gonna turn off video because nobody wants to see my face at that angle while I write notes. So I'm turning off my video, and I will take notes as people talk and type in the chat. And so I will write it exactly in the same way. So Lam or Kay, do one of you mind reminding me what those 4 different aspects were so that I can write them out up here?
Sure. So they are the purpose of the prison industrial complex, and maybe we should go through one at a time. So maybe we'll start with the purpose and get everyone's collaborative input, and then we'll move on to the second one. Is that okay with you, Vikrant?
Yeah. You're leading it, not me. So
Okay.
you let me know.
So yeah, so we'd love to hear from participants what they understand about what they think the purpose of the prison industrial complex, keeping in mind some of the points that Kay raised in terms of its connections to the military industrial complex, and then also historical perspectives, the academics, the resistors, also the government and politicians who have been involved in the creation of the complex. So I think, and pardon me, I'm not the best Zoom user, but I think is there a hand raise feature that it indicates to facilitators?
People are totally typing real quick, and I have the chat open, so I'll
Okay.
list some of those things and highlight them. And then Lam and Kay, if you want to comment on some of the things that people are saying, I think that would be super helpful. So I will say at least the ones that came up. So we got oppression, which I think, yes. And then another theme that showed up was labor exploitation. And then we've got profit, and we've got state capture. So if you want to comment on any of these things as people continue typing in the chat, feel free to, and I'll keep taking notes and writing some of the things that people say.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I guess this goes along with legalized slavery, but like anti-Blackness and also criminality, like the concept of like different groups of people being criminalized or being like deemed like inherently deviant.
Mm-hmm. I am getting so many good points. So I think Logan wrote here, ensuring that Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer folks, poor folks don't have access to resources or capital. Yes, I'm actually going to put that under oppression / and I'm going to write subjugation of, and I'm going to write everything you said out while other people are talking. Some folks John V put political gain for politicians. I think I got everything you said, Logan. If I didn't, let me know. Okay, cool. And then, yes. So political gain, political strength.
Also ableism.
Someone else put war on crime, and then I think, so I'm going to put that here with the war. Actually, sorry, this is all connected, so I'm going to, both of these are connected to a war on crime. Tool to solve perceived political threats, maintaining existing power structures, yeah. So I would say for maintaining hegemony. Does that sound appropriate, Macy? Okay, yes, sure. So that's great. And then voter disenfranchisement. Thank you, Natalie. I did not see that. Just zoom out a little bit so you can see this. My handwriting's not the best, sorry. I think that's it for people's thoughts thus far. KMM, do you have anything else you want to comment on before we move to the next piece of it?
Yeah, actually, I think I would like to comment on the labor exploitation and profit, because I think one of the things that I find really fascinating about the prison industrial complex is the historical background to both the term and also the trajectory that it's taken from the civil rights movement to the sort of immigrant rights movement that's going on now. So I apologize. Some of this is a very sort of lawyer-centric perspective, but that's what I'll share with you. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the military-industrial complex, that term, I think a lot of times it's actually attributed to Eisenhower in the early 60s, I think it's early 60s, late 50s, who actually warned about the emergence of this military-industrial complex and how the reason it's called a industrial complex is this socio-economic construct of how industry it emerged and became so powerful in the political space in the US. And that when we think about an industrial complex, the power emerges from this very capitalistic drive that we have in the US, where if you can control labor and if you can control the production of goods, you then end up being able to obtain power and as someone pointed out, maintaining that hegemonic power. So when you start with, in the 50s and 60s, this warning around the military-industrial complex, and you think about how many industries emerged and became extraordinarily powerful as a result of this military-industrial complex. Think of the power that the NRA and the gun industry has in our country now. And so they control this production, this means of production of guns. But as a result of the military and the focus that the US has on the military, think of the power that they have in our political space. And only now are we really seeing a challenge to their power. The amount of money that is spent on lobbying for guns and the influence that the gun lobbyists and the gun industry have upon politicians. Think of how many politicians in our country are basically bought by the NRA and gun manufacturers, and think of how much money is created by that. So then you shift it to the prison industrial complex. So you have prisons, certainly the private construction companies who are building the prisons, the prison and parole employees and those industries. Even the food service industry, there's going to have to be food served in these prisons. So think of the private companies who are making millions and millions of dollars off of providing food for individuals who are incarcerated. So just think of how complex this wide web of labor that sustains the prison industrial complex. And I'll bring it back to this issue of labor from a sort of legal historical perspective by saying the civil rights movement managed to pass a lot of employment labor protections. So you have sort of the National Labor Relations Act, which then allowed for unions to have political and socio-political power. You had the Title IX, which created protections based upon gender and sex. So during all this period, you had a lot of the rights that are being asserted for protections of workers. And those rights are a form of trying to resist controlling the labor market and ensuring that there's more equity and justice and fairness in the labor market. So as a result of that, the corporations and industries that were benefiting off of the control and the legalized slavery, as somebody described, of the labor market, which were vulnerable, women, people of color, indigenous populations, they then were protected as a result of this. So then what happens? As a result of this industrial complex, you then have the creation of the undocumented immigrant. So prior to the 70s, this idea of an immigrant who was undocumented was really pretty foreign. And I've spoken to a lot of people who used to be able to walk into what was then an INS building, which is now DHS, INS, and say, and like pay $100 and they get their green card. But
Wait, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. Can you say what INS is?
yeah, yes, sorry. INS was the Immigration and Naturalization Service. That was the precursor to now the Department of Homeland Security. So INS is essentially the the office which deals with immigration issues in the U.S. And it became DHS. But back in like the 70s, you could walk in and pay and say, I want my green card. I want to be a legal permanent resident. That happened, but as a result, and this is obviously my theory, and it's you don't take it as fact, but if you think about the creation of the undocumented immigrant and how, particularly in the 80s, all this the government and industries sort of raised this fear of these criminals coming into our country, people stealing our jobs. That really formulated a population that was undocumented. Guess what? One of the rights that undocumented people do not have, for the most part, the right to work and the legal protections that are given to employees and workers in this country. So as a result, you then have a new legalized class of people who are exploited for the control of the labor market. And so I wanted to provide that history to really emphasize just how completely omnipresent and extensive and comprehensive the prison industrial complex is, and really tie it to this idea of whoever controls the labor market and controls and is able to exploit labor and get cheap labor are the ones who are really invested in the maintenance and the perpetuation of industrial complexes.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So we'll take this. I think your comment brings us right to the next piece of it, which is actors and structures involved in maintaining the prison industrial complex. So maybe we can all start sharing about that. Does that sound okay? So I'm going to write here. Feel free to start typing in the chat and I'll do exactly what I did last time. So who are the people / structures involved in maintaining the PIC?
Democrats.
Kay, did you say Democrats? I just wanted to make sure. Yeah, Natalie, to your point, I would totally put that here. I was thinking of putting DHS / INS on here. Does that sound appropriate to your comment? Cool. DHS, INS, immigration. I like someone's point here about hiring committees and other like HR policies that ask for, I mean, there's been lots of movements to ban the box, and that's kind of where that comes from, right? It's impacting people's ability to come back to society, re-enter society, exist in society in general. Please tell me if I'm missing anyone's or just say it again. Okay, I see county sheriffs, DAs. Yes. County sheriffs, DAs. I see judges, yeah. I see ICE, so I'm gonna put that here. Schools, yes. The media, totally. Colleges and universities, totally. Okay, I think we got a little low in the chat right now. Perfect. So if Lam and Kay want to comment on any of these, I know I've got a billion thoughts on so many of these ones that have been listed, but I'll just say it again for the subtitles. We've got Democrats / politicians / the US government, corporations, hiring committees and jobs impacting reentry, DHS, INS, immigration, the immigration policies in general, and ICE, county sheriffs, DAs, judges, schools, media, colleges and universities, and yes, most importantly for a lot of the folks that are in this call, healthcare.
You can also include like child welfare or the family regulation system.
And I'll add a few more. So obviously, and we'll go, Kay and I will go into this, but lawyers and
I think we got a pretty good list.
But then I also want to talk about the security industry. So surveillance, I think, is a really important industry and a really important concept when you're thinking of the prison industrial complex, and this idea that has really emerged and is used as rationalization for a lot of the prison and military industrial complex, because it's really around controlling the population. And the last group that I wanted to mention is actually consumers, which is essentially all of us. If we are invested in we're looking for cheap goods. How are cheap goods produced? So cheap goods are often produced either by getting cheap labor in other countries or cheap labor in prisons. So keep that in mind when we think of ourselves going to the grocery store or going to make purchases.
I would also add in landlords.
Yes. Ban landlords 2020. Okay, cool. This looks like a pretty awesome list. What's the third piece that's on there? I think it's related to both of these, so it
I think it's who's impacted.
cool. Yeah, so I will put that here of who is directly impacted. I'm going to zoom in. A lot of people already said some, but just for my sake, so I can keep track and write it again, feel free to start typing in the chat and I'll compile. I'll start. Okay, so I see. So I put in Black and Indigenous folks. And I'm saying folks in communities of lower SES or low income communities, children of incarcerated folks, like that. Well, don't like that, but you know what I mean. I like that suggestion to put on here. Queer folks / LGBTQ plus folks. immigrant/migrant communities,
Sex workers.
sex workers.
And also criminalized survivors.
Can you say the last one? I heard criminalized survivors, but I wanted to make sure.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, folks who are houseless/displaced. Did I miss any? I think I did. Yes, EC said undocumented folks. I'm going to say undocumented here. Wow, my handwriting just got 10 times worse for a second. Okay, there. And then individuals with mental health conditions. Yeah, so I'm going to say, first I'm going to say disabled folks, and then in that I'm also going to add folks with mental health conditions. I think EC wrote trans folks, yeah. Trans folks, especially Black and brown trans femme folks/trans women. Yeah, totally. Yeah, folks in foster care. Yeah. So drug users, yeah. So drug users slash actually nothing there. Cool. It's a pretty large list. If there's other things that come to mind, I'll keep writing. But if KM Lam, if you want to comment, I know some of these we've really touched on already, but I think there's some that people have brought up that we haven't talked about. So like sex workers, criminalized survivors, folks who are houseless and displaced. We didn't really talk about how, aside from landlords, like urban developers, et cetera, also profit from this complex. So if you want to talk about some of these folks who are impacted, that'd be cool.
Yeah, I guess this would also, I should have added for actors, I should have added like domestic violence or like gender-based violence orgs, but I put criminalized survivors because that's who I organize around with Survived and Punished. And for the majority of orgs or people that are working around domestic violence, the prison industrial complex pretty much like forces them to like collaborate with police officers or collaborate with the state in order to receive funding. And so what happens is um, supposedly more laws are passed to protect survivors, but these laws fall down harder on survivors who are criminalized for protecting themselves. And those people usually end up being Black and brown women and also sex workers. So yeah.
Yeah. All right. And then I think our last piece is why do we use the term industrial complex? And I think a lot of people have talked about this, but just to make it explicit, I'm also going to write it out. So why is it called industrial complex? And so feel free to type in the chat. And I would say when you're thinking about this question, think about the two words together, but also think about the two words separately. So like industrial/industry means something and complex also means something. So let's think about both of them together, but also separately. As you type in the chat, let's think a little bit about this.
Maybe to start it off, I think of it as prison supporting industry and lifting it up and able to dive into as well.
Yeah, so industry, when we're saying this is supporting / maintaining prisons / other carceral systems for profit, right? Some other people said, yeah, so industry reminds me of production and profit. I'm not going to add production here because that's really important, especially when we're talking about labor. Yes, Logan is saying it helps us think less about individual actors and more structural analyses of power. Yes. Industry in that is built upon a want for goods and services rendered by those oppressed by it. Yes. And to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry. Yeah, so I'm gonna write here overlapping interests. God damn. Government plus industry. Yep. And then I got it's all very intertwined. Between contractors, businesses beyond just managing prisons, government, and consumers to sustain it. Yeah, so that's the piece around complex, right? That it's not just something, it's not just one thing. It's not that we can easily identify it. There's so many people that profit off of it, and it's continuously growing. Like Lam's comment about how we are also rapidly / have already become a surveillance state is a part of this, is that industry is not something that's old. It's also something that's relatively new. And so the complex keeps on adding as more and more industries, professions get involved. So I will say something that's continuously growing, interconnected, and complicated. Yeah, Ola's comment of a quick search shows that complex is from the Latin root complexus, which means to encircle or embrace, which makes me think of industries embracing prison and incarceration for profit. Yeah. So, yeah, totally. I'm going to say right here, embracing. I'm going to say embracing oppression plus subjugation for profit, if that's okay, Ola. If it's not, just let me know. And I'm going to add Akila's comment here, within a capitalist society. All right. Cool. So this was a really great exercise, I think, in helping define. I'm going to bring it back to the slides so that way you both can also talk about this next slide here.
Yeah, so this is a really helpful graphic about the prison industrial complex. And I like it because it points out just the fact that there's so many different players involved in maintaining the PIC. And it also directly names like victim rights groups. Something that I didn't get into earlier but want to talk about now is just the media. I think that a lot of people discount just how much the media impacts our perception of policing and also the way that harm is handled. And this could be anything from the news and books, but also things that seem like maybe harmless, like shows like Brooklyn Nine-Nine and also like Law and Order SVU. Just the ways that like the prison industrial complex works, like those different forms of media really stifle our imagination when we're trying to think about organizing, or also just trying to think about a world without police.
And I'll add what I particularly love about this infographic is just how comprehensive, how vast and vast the prison industrial complex is. But I wanted to actually draw sort of take a different perspective and actually answer a question that someone sent, which is how deeply embedded the prison industrial complex and the impulses and beliefs behind it are in our society. And it's so deeply grained into our country and how we understand justice, that in order to overcome the prison industrial complex, we just have to, there's so many different institutions that we have to challenge. And so in response to a question regarding the why prisons are allowed to exploit inmates for labor, it's actually in the 13th Amendment. So our Constitution actually allows for anyone, I think the term is just convicted. So anyone who is just convicted is actually exempt from the prohibition in the 13th Amendment against forced servitude. And so that's, I mean, if you think about it, right, that the Constitution that we think of as this document that is supposed to protect and is revered as this document of justice and rights and something that's like a holy grail, actually is the very document that allows for and promotes forced servitude. Oh, thank you. So I think somebody actually gave the exact language: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime. And so that is literally our country was built upon this notion that if you are duly convicted, that slavery and involuntary servitude is an acceptable form of punishment. Thanks, Peter.
All right, so that was a really great way for us to talk about the prison industrial complex and define it a little bit together. And I wanted to let Lam and Kay kind of take it from here in talking about their own positionalities and kind of how they are approaching this work. As you all saw, we're going to talk about positionality, then complicity, and organizing. So in this first piece, for both of them to kind of talk about their own positionalities and how that relates to their work. We'll leave the relates to their work for later, but maybe just talking a little bit about how you become aware of your own positionalities. And if folks want to do that in the chat, it's generally a very vulnerable thing the first time around, so it's okay if you don't want to. But if you want to in the chat, feel free to share as well.
I can start. So my dad is Nigerian, and then my mom is Black American. And I've always been extremely aware of my Blackness because my mom, I talk about this often, but like my mom really, she really politicized me at a really young age, honestly. And that's why I'm an organizer now. But yeah, so I was always aware of things like race, but I didn't really begin to like develop a deeper class analysis until I would say until I entered college. And then that's when I was able to understand that my parents' access to money, but also education, deeply impacted like my life's trajectory. And yeah, a lot of these things are changing, or they're not. Yeah, they change over time. Like there's things like age, but also stuff like ability. I identify as disabled, and in terms of all the other things on this like chart, that's a relatively newer development. And that's really impacted the way that I organize, but also my analysis around the prison industrial complex and how it preys and profits off of disabled people.
Thanks, Kay, for sharing. And I'm inspired by Kay's sharing, so I can share you a little bit about my background. So I was born in Vietnam, and when we first came to this country, my family and I experienced a great deal of hardship, specifically around class. So we ate in soup kitchens, we were on welfare. So a lot of my early experiences were with very severe poverty. I came out, so I'm gonna sort of age myself, but in 1993, when I was 14, I came out as, well, gay, now identify as queer. And that was definitely a very, something that really impacted my perspective and impacted my engagement with society and others. And so through those lens, I've really, of being an immigrant, of being queer, coming from a low income family, has really affected how I viewed my position in our society. But I actually want to draw from that and speak to the privilege and entitlements that I have, because I think one of the things that is really critical for us to understand any industrial complex and our position and our relationship to it is to not only interrogate our positionality in terms of the impact that it has upon us, but also the impact and the way that our privilege contributes to, either contributes to or makes us complacent to maintaining those industrial complexes. I'm a lawyer. I have grad degrees. I now am, quote unquote, an executive director, and I have to make, I do have a lot of power. My education, my occupation, in some ways, even my race as the model minority. I'm going to be I remember being in court and being treated a certain way when I really embodied the model minority stereotype to a judge. So I think that's something that's really important and is actually a great transition to the next part of our webinar, which is how does our positionality make us complicit, or at the very least complacent, or contribute to these industrial complexes, and are we self-interrogating ourselves enough in order to challenge how these industrial complexes operate?
Yeah, so I earned my master's of social work, I think in 2018. But I initially went into grad school because, I understood that there is this whole savior narrative behind social work, but I didn't really understand how deeply harmful the field of social work was until I earned my MSW. Like I was saying before, a lot of nonprofits where a lot of social workers end up working have to comply or collaborate with the prison industrial complex in order to receive funding. And it's really interesting because when conversations around abolition were becoming more popular a couple months ago, a lot of people were calling to replace cops with social workers. But in many communities, social workers do function as cops, and not just social workers, but other professions that are thought of as helping professions. They do function as cops in the sense that they maintain power over people that they're supposedly supposed to be helping. For my day job, I don't have a typical social work job. I work at a nonprofit that does restorative justice work for people who've been accused of, quote unquote, violent crimes. But even there, the work that we're doing is really impactful, and a lot of people point to it as kind of a template for abolition, but our clients still participate with the fear of knowing that if they don't comply with certain components of the program, they could still face incarceration. So I think a lot of people, or a lot of social workers might say that the goal of our job is to work ourselves out of a job, but it wasn't until I started becoming an abolitionist and actually reading more that I began to like deeply, deeply understand that.
Thank you both for sharing. I think I'd like to zoom out a little bit and just ask, how do you define and maybe think about for yourself complicity versus resistance? Because of course it's so hard not to be complicit in such a deeply embedded system.
Well, from like an organizing perspective, so outside of my paid job, the majority of my time is spent organizing around or against the prison industrial complex. And so it's not enough to just think, oh, things are bad, like, oh, the prison industrial complex is bad, incarceration is bad, anti-Blackness is bad. But what are you doing to like actively work against it? And also bring these conversations up in your places of employment, but also doing things within your power to kind of like subvert like this culture that like tells us that this is acceptable or that this is okay. A lot of people are talking now about like what it means to like show up or like support people, but for me that looks like ceding power. So it looks like actively working and like actively spending time and money and resources to dismantle a system versus just acknowledging its existence but not doing anything about it.
And so I hope this response is not overly complicated or boring, but so this is a question that I think about a lot, you know, especially as a lawyer, where lawyers not, let's face it, lawyers are not the most radical people in the world. And so I'm part of an industry that definitely contributes to the many industrial complexes, including the prison industrial complex, and operates in a system of trying to maintain the status quo a lot. And I think, you know, I think a lot about, and I'm not sure if you guys, if you haven't, I read, when I was a grad student, I read a lot of Michel Foucault. And when I think about Michel Foucault's understanding of power, I do think that there is a great deal of truth to Foucault's theory that resistance is actually a part of power and hegemony in its own way. That, you know, as soon as there's resistance, hegemony sort of swallows it up. So when I think about how do we reconcile complicity with resistance, I think about what does it mean for resistance to be swallowed up by the existing power. And I actually think, you know, I think the work that you guys are doing here is actually a really, really great example of how resistance can occur even when there's a consciousness of complicity, which is in order for an institution, in order for hegemony to sort of co-opt or incorporate resistance, it has to shift. So if you think of the industry in which you operate, or you think in the institution in which you operate, so whether it be K as in social work or I in law, if we can resist enough to push the legal industry more to the left, or to be more revolutionary, to be more radical, to be less complicit, in order for the institutions that might swallow our resistance, in order for them to actually swallow us up, they actually have to move. So as a result, the work that you guys are doing here in the medical industry, you know, this may end up being co-opted, and you maybe end up being complicit. But in order for that to happen, you've pushed the medical industry, or I've pushed the legal industry to be more radical, to be more conscious, to think about that. So in 10 years, you know, what the conversation is going to look hopefully will look very different, and complicity will be something that actually would sound radical to us 10 years before. So, you know, that's my how I reconcile for myself that you can still resist even if you acknowledge your own complicity in that very resistance.
Thank you for that. And you both have spoken a little bit on how lawyering and social work individually supports the prison industrial complex. Do you think you could talk about how they entangle with each other and both support one another in the system?
At my day job or my paid job, I do work with a lot of lawyers, but I'm not like an expert on this. I just know that like most social workers that I know who do macro social work, which means that they don't have individual clients, do work with lawyers, and they do maintain power over people.
Yeah, I to a certain extent, I agree. I think lawyers operate from a position of power. I'm not sure if we're gonna get to this or when we'll get to it, but a lot of the work that we do at Beyond is really trying to what we call depower lawyers and have them shift the power that they have over quote unquote clients or other collaborators like social worker, and shift that away from lawyers and the legal industry. But I do think Kay is spot on that we do the legal system and lawyers as an institution operate from, we have power. There are some people who with whom we will share power, and some that we want to exclude from having that power. And if you think of laws, and even if you think of rights in our country, it's all, the way that the discourse happens is always who is protected under the Constitution. This case applies. This Supreme Court case that gives rights to immigrants. Well, it applies to these 30,000 immigrants who are DACA. It's actually DACA is much higher. So the millions of people who have DACA. But then at the same time, it also says, well, then there are the 25 million people who don't have DACA, who don't have these rights. That's the very system of law operates from a perspective of we control power and we'll share with some people, but then we will exclude it for others.
So I guess because the system of law and even social work to an extent is so built on these power systems, when you're thinking about complicity and organizing, is the main like resistance that you both face, do you think it comes from like these power systems being so large, or do you think it's like a lack of time also because you're so saddled with other stuff, or do you find investment from your peers and coworkers and support from them as well? I think it's a question about like how do you maintain resistance, and I think that'll also lead us into the question in the chat in just a second.
I think the biggest thing that I face is not time, but just public ideas about like safety or policing. There's this idea of the other, like, and the other is usually a Black person or a disabled person or a sex working person, etc., who people think that they need to be kept, I'm using quotation marks, kept safe from. And so, yeah, the biggest burden I have is just people who don't want to talk about what it would mean to like dismantle these systems because it questions everything that they know. Other than that, my coworkers and I are all on the same page because we work in a similar environment. And I enjoy organizing outside of work. But yeah, the main thing is just people who are really fearful of like what it would mean to have.
And my response is it's the it is the funding issue. I'm not sure if it was Kay or Vikrant or who put in the revolution will not be funded, but you know, as someone who runs a nonprofit organization, a lot of the challenges that we face in terms of being truly radical or truly resistant comes down to how do I make sure the lawyers and the paralegals and the non-attorneys in the office get paid? How do we keep the lights on? Because and how do we ensure that the community members whose cases we're working on get their cases complete? Because you know we have thousands of people who are facing eviction, facing criminal convictions, facing deportation. how do we balance being really radical and seek systemic change, at the same time take money that allows us to work with and support individuals whose lives are very much at stake. So this idea of do we support, and I think this goes very much to medicine, right? There are individual lives in your hands. And let me rephrase that. I don't want to suggest that I have any amazing power to save that person's life, but I mean, the work I do impacts somebody's life and livelihood. That's an individual, but a lot of times working on that individual and ensuring that I can best support that individual and collaborate with that individual might come at the expense of very systemic change, because I'm taking money from a source that doesn't believe in, oh, let's have a revolution and make sure that all billionaires and millionaires redistribute all their money to those who don't have that. So I think the second part of the question is, I think my coworkers, my colleagues, those who share my values are ones with whom I get a lot of support. But I think the challenge comes down to this question of, can resistance be funded in our capitalistic society?
That's my gut answer is no, just because I'm like, capitalism exists on the justification of exploitation, and that is the only way that it can be sustained. But I will leave it to other people to answer that question. Okay, but I think both of what you've talked about really brings us into this next question of like, how do you choose to organize? I think Kay's kind of brought it up and Lami brought it up as well, and we have your slides on some of the things that you wanted to talk about, but how you both navigate organizing against the prison industrial complex. So Kay, I'm gonna leave it to you first to talk a little bit about some of the work that you do.
Okay. Yeah, so I've been organizing for 6.5 years, but I didn't start really like organizing, I guess, full-time-ish around abolition until I moved to New York about a year and a half ago. So like I said before, like a previous slide said, I'm a member of Survived and Punished, which I'll get into. I'm also a member of Free Them All for Public Health, which is a campaign specifically around freeing people based in New York in the face of COVID. And I'm also a co-creator of aidtoabolition.com, which is it's a website / like, I guess, a political education tool around different steps that would help us work towards an abolitionist world. I think there's some confusion around it because people have approached us before and been like, oh, wow, is this a policy platform? Or, oh, is this really incomplete? But it really just came as a response to 8 Can't Wait, which is a set of 8 reforms that was put out by Campaign Zero. And they knew that if those 8 reforms were implemented, police violence would decrease by 72%. And we kind of just saw that rhetoric as harmful because as abolitionists, we recognize the entire system of policing to be violent. And also we knew that a lot of the reforms that were proposed in 8 Can't Wait, sorry, my phone is going off, that were proposed in 8 Can't Wait were already implemented in different places, like, for example, choke holding bans and things like that. So yeah, Aid to Abolition is just a group of people that I organize with or write with, and we're building out some things from the website, but I just wanted to point it out because that has been getting some traction in recent months.
Totally. Yeah, and we put the link in the slides too, so for folks to, obviously if you search Aid to Abolition, it's the first thing that comes up, but it's also in the slides for folks to reference later. And then I also got here Survived and Punished that you're involved in, Kay.
Yeah, so Survived and Punished is my political home, and it's a group of people who are working to free and support criminalized survivors. So we run survivor defense campaigns, which means that we raise awareness about different cases where survivors are being criminalized in an effort to free them. We also have a newsletter that goes across the country to our comrades inside prisons and outside, which talks about the different work that we're doing, and we use that to fund our mutual aid projects. We also have a social media presence that I co-run with someone else, and we're about to actually have a radio show that airs weekly. And we also have a group that works on specifically targeting people like Governor Cuomo to free, to commute the sentences of survivors. I like Survived and Punished so much because it's not just my organizing home, but it really broadened my analysis around like transformative justice and restorative justice, and getting to build relationships with people like Miriam Kaba and other people who've been doing this work for a while has really improved my organizing overall.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Lam, I'm gonna let you take it away now to talk about Beyond Legal Aid.
Yeah, so Beyond Legal Aid is the organization that, for which I'm the executive director. I actually also founded the organization. And so a little bit of context for non-lawyers. So I've been a legal aid attorney all of my career, and a legal aid attorney being someone who generally provides free legal services to low-income and other quote-unquote vulnerable populations. And in my career, I've worked a lot with what's called the Legal Services Corporation. So the Legal Services Corporation is the largest funder of legal aid in our country. It's a government institution. And what I've really discovered, and is the basis, the inspiration for the founding of Beyond Legal Aid, is that the government gives out about 350 to 400 million a year, and the restrictions that come with it are basically everything that contributes to the prison industrial complex. So an example is you cannot represent undocumented immigrants for the most part. There are some exceptions. Another exception is you cannot represent any prisoners. So the legal aid, which is supposed to be for those who are low income and quote unquote vulnerable. And if you think about that, one of the populations you would immediately think about would be prisoners, right? And undocumented immigrants who are facing deportation. But the government says, well, if you take our money, you can't work with these people. And it's actually so severe. It's not, you can't take our money to work on those cases. If you take our money, your entire organization, you can't even use money, other sources of money, to take on these cases. So you have this government system that really is the dominant presence in legal aid. So lawyers who want to work with low-income communities, for the most part, are stuck in this system of denying so many people access. And they also do things like really undermine activism or systemic work. So you can't work with any organizers if you take funding from the Legal Services Corporation. You can't be involved in anything that could be quote unquote engage criminality or support criminal activity. So all of the things that really would create resistance and radical change, you're excluded from doing. And so I created Beyond Legal Aid because I realized that, you know, as someone who really who is looking to seek social justice, to seek more systemic, radical change, I'm not going to be able to do it under a traditional legal aid model. And so then how do we do it in a way that does address and create more systemic, more possibility and more potential for systemic change? And so the model that we came up with, which we call community activism lawyering, is this idea of, as I mentioned, depowering lawyers, taking that power away from lawyers and putting it into the communities that are impacted by injustice. And the way we do that is making sure that all of our work is located in communities, that they're done in collaboration, and the programs that we have are actually operated and really owned by the community. So we have about, I think last I count was 23 programs, all of which are actually owned by our community partners. We provide the legal services, but but they make all, it's their program. They name it, it's in their space, the hours they decide what cases they take. And that's the final piece, is everything is decided by our community partners. So we are at their beck and call, and we do what they tell us. And the reason we do that is because we recognize that systemic change is going to come at a very grassroots level. And it's actually the communities who are impacted who have the potential and the power for resistance. And so what we want to do is basically empower and amplify their work. And we provide them with the legal services that we have as an additional tool for their toolbox for social change. So if we could go on to the next slide.
Totally.
So really, the depowering lawyers and empowering communities. So that's the work that we do. So at the moment we have, I think we have 13 attorneys, 23 programs in Cook, DuPage, Lake, and one more county, and Kane County. And so what we do there is we basically really try to support communities to run their own programs. And at the same time, a really important part of our work is also to change lawyers. How do we get lawyers to no longer think that they're in charge, they're there to save people, but rather that lawyers are just really a collaborator in a much bigger process of creating social change. And so we really emphasize, how can we as lawyers be more humble and vulnerable? How can we transform from these know-it-alls who are boring and stodgy to people who are really engaged with communities and are listening and are willing to share and be vulnerable and self-interrogate themselves? How do we relearn what it means to problem solve? I'm sure this is something that Kay has experience with. We always tend to think like, oh yes, we'll file a lawsuit, we'll run to court, I will argue to any judge, but that a lot of times that actually is not the best way to solve the problem. So how do we get lawyers to really relearn to say that your goal is to solve a problem, and it does not necessarily mean you being in charge or you using the law. It could be you getting coffee for the organizers who are planning an action that will actually create more change than a lawsuit. And then the final part is, I think Kay actually mentioned this about the idea of ceding control, and how do we sort of no longer be complicit by really ceding our power, and through that process actually reshape what it means to be involved with the law and what it means to be a lawyer. And then the final slide is some examples that we're currently working on, and that we hope will really contribute. So the idea is we want to contribute, we want to support, we want to amplify the campaigns, the projects from the communities that we believe will actually create the change and create the resistance that is so critical. So some of the projects that we're currently supporting are an effort to erase the Chicago gang database. So Chicago has been keeping a really ridiculous, unreasonable gang database where police officers or even like principals can say, oh, I think this person is a gang member. And that person then is on this database. And then that database is used for things like, surveillance, being targeted for criminal prosecution, or for deportation. So we're part of a coalition of many grassroots organizations to try to eliminate Chicago's use of the gang database. Obviously, eliminate ICE, the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. So DHS, which oversees a lot of immigration in the U.S., is composed of several different branches. So there's USCIS, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, which handles things like visas and green cards. There's Customs and Border Patrol, which is the people at the borders, and then ICE is the enforcement branch, and they're the ones who are engaging in the mass deportation that's going on right now. The Fight for 15, so that's the campaign to increase the minimum wage to $15. It's a national campaign. We're supporting the local efforts in Illinois, and we've already spoken a lot about how labor and the control of labor is really critical to the maintenance of the prison industrial complex. And then we have the second legal clinic dedicated to the rights and legal needs of sex workers. And as part of that, we do a lot of work around the decriminalization of sex work, but also really engaging with sex workers' employment rights, and really seeing that they're workers who have a right to labor protections. And it's not about criminality. It's really about how do we ensure that their work is being recognized in a human rights framework that all workers should have protections for.
Thank you, both of you, so much for sharing. I think people can see a lot about how, you both organize both within and outside of your professions in the kinds of work that you choose to pursue. So this is the time. If you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat. If you want to say your question over the mic, just say stack, type stack in the chat, and that way we know who's coming up next and we'll call you out, just to minimize any confusion. And we'll do that maybe, we have very little time, so we're gonna do it for like 3 to 5 minutes if we can. And then obviously if there's more questions, we'll keep it, but that way we can move to small groups. So I think there is one question that was already there that we didn't get a chance to talk about. So we can start with that. This is from Natalie. Natalie is saying, having come from a small rural town, I know a lot of people argue that the system is just in that the prisoners should have to pay back for their crime / pay for the resources that go to keeping them incarcerated. I've really struggled to come up with a counter because it's really difficult to convince others to care about those conditions. And I think, Kay, you mentioned this as like one of the things that you really struggle with is like, your work challenges their entire worldview on how they see these criminalized other folks, whether that's Black folks, disabled folks, queer folks, Indigenous folks. And so maybe you could start by answering this question, and then we can go with Lam and see what you both have to say about it.
Yeah, I would say that first, I think most people assume that people who are incarcerated have actually committed a crime, but that's a faulty assumption right off the bat. And then also, a lot of discourse around people who are incarcerated ignore the conditions that crime takes place in. And that's also something that I would argue or push back against. And then it's not about incarcerated people like making back or like paying back the money that it takes to keep them incarcerated, because that's not really the issue. If you're looking, or if you're operating under the framework of like the prison industrial complex, then you're doing it with the analysis that actually like there's incentive to keep people incarcerated. There's money being made off of their incarceration instead of being lost. And people are being incarcerated for people's financial or political gain. So I would actually argue that the opposite is happening. And then, sorry, I think that like also a lot of people would argue that there needs to be like some form of policing or some form of prisons, but then also in the same breath say that they are in support of like racial justice, or they're in support of like anti-racism work, and you can't have it both ways. So I would just point to just like the statistics of people who are incarcerated and how they're overwhelmingly people of color, especially Black people. You can't tell me that you're in support of a system that assumes that every Black person is guilty or deviant in some way, and then also tell me that you're in support of like anti-racism work. And so that's something else that I would point to.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
So I think Kay nailed it. The only thing, I think all the reasons that Kay mentioned, I think are the arguments that you really need to expose people who make these statements. The only thing I would add as an attorney, when I think about how to be persuasive and share these arguments, I would just add, ask these people, Natalie, all the things that Kay said, ask them if they were to commit a crime, or quote unquote commit a crime, or if they were to face potential incarceration or the criminal justice system, are these things that Kay mentioned the ones that they would want to have to face if they were to do something wrong? Because I think a lot of it, a lot of the times when we engage in these very controversial issues, we can actually really reduce it to a very human level and ask people to really think about, what does it mean? What if you take this and you think about the conditions in which quote unquote a crime occurred? If you think about the conditions that people have to deal with in prison, and you say, here's what's going on, and then ask that person to apply it to themselves or their family, I think that a lot of times really can shift people's minds, because it's easy to say, oh yeah, well, that random stranger, that person I don't know, has to pay for their crime. But then when you say, but should they pay for their crime by being basically forced into servitude? Should they be if you were that person, do you think that is what should happen? Do you think it should be right that they have no rights whatsoever? For example, if you're undocumented, that you have no rights for certain medical care. Is that what you think should happen if you were facing that same situation, or your child was facing that situation?
Always bring the children in, yeah. Ola's question, and just to be conscious of people's time, we'll bring that to be the last question, so that we can move to the small groups. Would abolition of the prison industrial complex help topple the school to prison pipeline, or are these related but separate mechanisms of oppression? I can totally answer this question. So we actually have a 4-part series, and one of the sessions is actually about the school to prison nexus. And so we definitely see all of these things as interconnected, because I may not have been in the graphic, I think it was, but schools are a part of this. Aside from universities and other larger school systems investing in private prisons and investing in the industries that maintain private prisons, they also are able to essentially decide who is pushed into prison. And we see that through different systems like the tracking systems in our education system, and also in the ways that we have school security guards, and also in the ways, yes, Push Out is a really great book, actually, thank you. And there's several really, really great books about the criminalization of Black children, especially. And those will be listed in the resource list for that session, so look out for that. Cool.
Okay, so at this point, we will stop recording in a few seconds. I'd like to thank Lam and Kay for being here, sharing their experiences and their perspectives, enlightening us, guiding discussion. And for the small group sessions, which I will open in just a second, we will be going over complicity and positionality, both reflecting and discussing as a group. So I will break us out now, and then we'll bring everyone back. So don't just leave, come back, okay?
We'll stop the recording first, right?
No, potty breaks?
Stop the recording first.
Recording, yes, yes.